This week's lecture for Connected Classrooms looks more closely at the highly contested relationship between the integration of digital technologies and student learning. Does integrating technology into classrooms make a difference to student learning? Governments globally have spent billions of dollars investing in digital technologies in schools. In Australia alone, the market for digital technologies in the education sector is roughly $2.5 billion. That includes university and TAFEs, but schools have a reasonable share of that market. So is the government in Australia or in the UK or the United States or anywhere else where technology has been invested in heavily, are governments getting an adequate return on their investment in digital technologies in schools? The main measurement of educational success that has dominated the educational discourse for some time, particularly in Australia, is our relative standing in international educational benchmarking exercises such as PISA, or on a national level, the NAPLAN results. These are what are considered measures of student achievement. So the question that is being asked in some quarters is this: does investment in digital technologies lead to improvements in student learning outcomes, otherwise called student achievement? What does the research say about the impact of digital technologies on learning and teaching? Recently, the OECD released its report, Students, Computers and Learning, Making the Connection. You can access it online. I've given you a link to the report website on the Week 6 Learning Resources page. The report examines the relationship between investment in digital technologies and student attainment. The results are not promising, and you may have in fact heard some of the media coverage, particularly on radio, that surrounded the release of the report 2 weeks ago. The findings of this very large-scale meta-analysis suggest that the reality in our schools lags considerably behind the promise of technology and the rhetoric that surrounds the integration of technology. This report concludes that even though 96% of 15-year-olds in the OECD countries have access to a computer at home, and 72% of these 15-year-olds use technology at schools, the impact on student achievement is mixed at best. Results from this report show that there are no appreciable improvements in student achievement in reading, mathematics or science in the countries that had invested heavily in ICT for education, including Australia. Positive correlations between high levels of ICT integration and improved student achievement are limited to certain contexts and uses. There's a couple of points there that immediately raise questions for me. One is why only reading, mathematics or science, and that's a point that I'll come back to in more length later in this lecture. And secondly, the report doesn't exactly explain what the certain contexts and uses are where student achievement improves. So it's a couple little points that I find a little problematic. One part of the report also suggests that using drill and practice software for mathematics and languages show a clear negative relationship with student performance, suggesting that the more you use drill and practice software in maths and language education, the poorer the student performance. Now that one I don't have a problem with and tends to reinforce my personal philosophy about where it's best to use technology. But again, more on that later. The OECD report is the most recent report on the relationship between investment in digital technologies and student learning. But there is quite a history of studies, particularly meta-studies, that have examined the relationship between technology integration and student learning. Back in the early 2000s, Larry Cuban undertook another meta-analysis of the integration of digital technologies and reported his findings in his book, Oversold and Underused. He found that no advances that were measured by higher academic outcomes that were achieved over the previous decade could confidently be attributed to broader access to computers. So, as with the OECD, he found no direct relationship between technology use and improvement in academic outcomes. John Hattie's 2009 meta-analysis of the impact factors on students' learning of a range of innovations shows that innovations involving digital technologies have no more of an impact on student achievement than most other innovations. That is, very little impact on student learning, particularly when compared to the impact of the quality of teaching, which is his big thing. Consistent amongst these and some other researchers is the line that digital technologies have not improved learning as measured by benchmarking activities like NAPLAN and PISA results. However, are we asking the right questions? I think we're not. For me, there are three questions that I tend to think about when discussing the debate about the impact of ICT on student learning. The first question is, why is this even an issue? Is the purpose of integrating digital technologies into schools to improve student learning outcomes as measured by NAPLAN or PISA results? Or is it to equip our students with digital literacies and a range of skills such as collaboration, creativity, problem solving, higher order thinking and digital citizenship that are essential for productive life in 21st century society? That's question number one. Question number two, what measures of student learning are most relevant when thinking about the integration of digital technologies? Is it reading, mathematics and science as focused on in the OECD report, or are there more relevant skills, knowledges and understandings that we should be examining, but which are much more difficult to measure? In other words, not everything that counts can be counted. And the third question, and I think this is a really important question, is it just the technology that acts on student learning? Is there a direct and singular causality, or are there more complex issues at play when we're talking about what acts on or shapes student learning? Does linking spending on digital technologies directly to narrow measures of learning, such as in PISA or in NAPLAN, buy into this simplistic debate that generally surrounds digital technologies integration? There are a lot of factors that act on a student's learning. The argument that simply putting digital technologies into a classroom and learning will improve is what people like Seymour Papert refers to as a technocentric argument. Neil Selwyn, another person I've asked you to read in previous lectures, calls it blind enthusiasm. But whichever name you put on this line of reasoning, i.e. that you put technology in a classroom and students' learning will improve, is a naive approach. Learning is impacted by a much broader range of factors, and trying to attribute it to one factor is simplistic in the extreme. I want to explore this issue a little bit more. Digital technologies are frequently positioned as being a disruptive innovation. Clay Christensen, in his 2011 book Disrupting Class, talks about the potential of digital technologies to reshape learning in the same way that digital technologies has turned business on its head. And he uses the often trotted out examples of newspaper and print media or retail shopping, which have been transformed as a result of changes and evolution of digital technologies. I'm yet to see that school education has been turned on its head, despite playing in this digital sandpit for the last 20 years and hearing the same rhetoric being espoused that digital technologies are transforming education. I've also been guilty of peddling the same line. I do believe that there is potential for transformation, but it requires more than simply spending money on digital boxes and putting them in classrooms. But why is this argument being trotted out? I think it's because the people who are peddling the argument have a really strong vested interest in perpetuating these myths or the hype around digital technologies. As I said earlier, the Australian EdTech market is worth about $2.5 billion annually. That's a lot of equipment that IT companies are selling. For governments as well, who are the other peddlers of the argument, it's much easier to take a simplistic perspective that more money on more equipment will lead to better learning, and think here about the $2.4 billion of funding given to schools under Kevin Rudd's digital education revolution of a few years ago. It's easier to throw money at equipment than it is to spend money on the much more challenging task of supporting teacher professional learning about how best to use digital technologies, or to even investigate ways of measuring other things that might count. Back to the OECD report and its rather dismal report card on the links between digital technologies and student learning. The report offers three possible interpretations of its finding. One interpretation it offers is that building deep conceptual understanding and higher order thinking requires intensive teacher-student interactions, and that technology sometimes distracts from this valuable human engagement. An interesting point. What do you think? Another interpretation is that we have not yet become good enough at the kind of pedagogies that make the most of technology. That adding 21st century technology to 20th century teaching practices just dilutes the effectiveness of teaching. I'm a little bit interested in that one. A third interpretation that it offers, and I am quoting here, if we want students to become smarter than a smartphone, we need to think harder about the pedagogies we are using to teach them. Technology can amplify great teaching, but great technology cannot replace poor teaching. Larry Cuban and Clay Christensen, I referred to earlier, also put forward this line of argument. Despite their disappointment at the lack of improvements in student learning as measured by standardised tests and international benchmarks, they both argue that it's not the technology that's important, but what you do with it. How the technology is applied and what makes it possible are the important things to analyse. So for me, I think it may be much more relevant to look at how technologies are being used rather than how much technology is available. To me and to others, technologies have not improved learning enough because other changes have not been made, and those changes are primarily to the way we teach, to the pedagogies we adopt. So I want to re-emphasise some of those sorts of pedagogical practices that I want you to think about in reflecting on your own experience on placement and projecting forward into the future about the kind of teacher you want to be and the kind of pedagogical approaches you plan to adopt. Over the last 2 or 3 lectures, I have examined the relationship between learning and digital technologies by looking through the theoretical lenses of connectivism and constructionism. To recap those, both these views of learning see learning increasingly as a constructivist phenomenon. By that I mean that people construct new knowledge and understanding based on what they already know and believe, and how they make sense of their experiences in the world. Learning in these views is also seen as a social phenomenon occurring in a community or in a networked way with other people. If, like me, you accept this view of learning, then as teachers we need to be making the shift away from the 20th century strongly teacher-centric pedagogies of information transmission to more student-centred approaches such as those promoted by Seymour Papert and David Jonasson. Now, to remind you, Seymour Papert you were introduced to in week 5 around constructionism, and David Jonasson you were asked to read one of his chapters in week 2. According to Jonasson, meaningful learning with technology needs to see digital technologies used as a cognitive partner, where the student learns with the technology rather than learning simply about the technology as you would if you were positioning digital technologies as a separate curriculum study area, the IT subject, or where technology is positioned as a delivery tool where we learn from the technology, much the same way that I am using technology in this course to deliver my online content to you and to record and manage your assignment submissions and your marking processes. These are part of technology use, but the meaningful or powerful learning with technology, Jonathan argues, happens when students use technology to access and analyse information, where they interpret and transform that information into their own personal knowledge, and then when they represent that knowledge to others. And one of our lectures was focused on using technology as a representational tool for students to demonstrate what they know and understand. Jonathan goes further to argue that this happens best, where technology is a cognitive partner, happens best when students are asked to use technology as a tool to accomplish authentic tasks and to solve authentic problems, where digital technologies allow the learner to do real work, not just made-up work. What might this look like? I've taken this example from one of the readings I've suggested that you look at this week by Peggy Ertmer and one of her colleagues. She writes extensively in this digital technologies field and provides a number of examples in the article I have suggested that you read this week. So here we have the scenario. Students in School A communicate with students in School B on the other side of the country or on the other side of the world on a particular project. In Ertmer's example, it was a project on renewable energy sources. So how do they use technology? They use Google Docs to establish their research questions, to form report outlines and to organise the information that they're finding online. They use Skype to communicate with each other. They also use blogs and wikis as a way of collaborating. They then use this really cool thing that I had not come across before called Cover It Live, which is a live blogging tool, and they use that to virtually conduct their experiments in real time. They then used a variety of other programs like Comic Life. Oh, and my other little icons have disappeared. VoiceThread, Glogster, Book Creator, a variety of different Web 2 tools to produce their final products. And interestingly, in this example, students got to choose their tools, and the research suggests that giving them choices made the projects much more personally meaningful and resulted in an increase in motivation. The article goes on to talk about a number of other examples, and examples I've drawn from other places. Providing podcasts of lessons like I'm doing in this lecture enables you, the learner, to review the content. I'm also providing the content in multiple modes. I use graphics and visuals and text and voice. Concept mapping is another tool that helps us to visualize our thinking and are really valuable, according to research, in helping students develop deeper cognitive structures that are thematically organised and richer in their interconnections. And whilst mind mapping or concept mapping has been around forever, digital mind mapping allows for much easier editing and recreation than any paper-based or print-based versions. So there are some examples of what this more student-centred learning might look like. Many of the examples of cases where digital technologies are seen as effective cognitive partners for learners involve student-centred learning. And the most effective pedagogies that we have researched so far are what's called this family of based learning. A very strange term, but it really refers to inquiry-based learning, project-based learning, challenge-based learning, and problem-based learning approaches. As a family of pedagogies, they share some commonalities but have some slightly different specialisms. But in any of these very learner-centred approaches, technology can be a stimulus for inquiry through videos or websites or images. Think Pinterest, people. Digital technologies can be a support for the inquiry process, gathering information. For the secondaries, think Storify. Processing that information, visual analysis, spreadsheets, database, concept maps, supporting collaboration between students who are working together. Again, think back from the previous slide of wikis and blogs and Skype. And then technology can be used to present the outcomes, any of the myriad of applications that we've looked at in this course, so cartoons, book creator, telegamis and vokis, and so on and so forth. In summary, technology that's used in teacher-centred classrooms are peripheral, primarily supporting content delivery and managing records. And I want here to make a link back to some previous learning around the SAMAR model, where we talked about substitution, augmentation, modification, and reinvention. In a teacher-centred classroom, it's really hard to move beyond augmentation. It's really hard to move into the reinvention unless the pedagogy is reinvented. By contrast, technology that's used in a student-centred classroom has a much more central role. And perhaps this is what those Larry Cuban and the OECD people are getting at when they're talking about perhaps we are not yet good enough at the sorts of pedagogies where technology does make a difference. Perhaps these are the sorts of pedagogical shifts that need to be made. I want now to return to the second question I posed. What do we measure? Where I pointed out that not everything that counts can be measured. Now, I don't want here to be seen as being dismissive of the importance of student achievement in science, mathematics and reading. Far from it. However, I'm not so convinced that there's a direct link or causality between introducing technology and student achievement in those particular outcomes. What I am arguing, though, is that other things count when we're talking about integrating digital technologies. I strongly believe that digital technologies contribute positively to skills development in a range of areas that currently aren't counted in international or national benchmarking exercises. How can we measure digital skills like our students' ability to locate relevant content and then to evaluate that content that they have found? Their ability to solve problems, their ability to collaborate with people from other parts of the world, their skills in representing what they know using all of the modes of media that are available to us now. How do we measure their creativity and their initiative? What about their levels of motivation and engagement? Their ability to communicate online and offline? How do we measure their attitudes towards learning and their self-esteem, those affective domains of learning that we know as teachers are crucial to the success of our students in any benchmarking exercise? All of these things are important 21st century skills, which industry is increasingly demanding of education. Yet I don't see any of these being measured or even discussed in the debate about the impact of digital technologies on student learning. Certainly not something that is the focus of the OECD report. But there's one throwaway line hidden away on page 190 of that report that says many other benefits of digital technologies fall outside of what PISA can measure. I think that says a whole lot. When you look at a very broad range of small-scale qualitative case study research, the sort of studies that John Hattie and the OECD tend not to look at, you find teachers reporting much improved outcomes in all of these domains. Perhaps that then is what digital technologies are aimed at, rather than those things that are easier to measure but which still count enormously in the 21st century workplace and indeed in society. So here are my 3 takeaway points from this week's lecture. Firstly, learning is complex and influenced by multiple factors, not just by technology. Trying to establish causality, a direct causality between technology and learning outcomes, is simplistic in the extreme. Second, not everything that counts can be counted. Perhaps we need to start counting other things that count in the 21st century rather than using 20th century measures of student achievement. The third thing, and I just love this quote, if we want our students to be smarter than a smartphone, we need to think harder about the pedagogies we are using to teach them. Technology can amplify great teaching, but great technology cannot replace poor teaching. This speaks to the need for redefinition of pedagogy around the introduction of digital technologies, rather than simply substituting technology for teaching approaches that are no longer as relevant